Welcome to Geopolitics Demystified, and I'm your host, S.L. Canthan. We have a brilliant guest today, Professor Wolff from the US. He is a very popular but non-mainstream economist, and I have watched maybe thousands of his videos online on YouTube. So, well, I don't think of myself as a socialist, but I love listening to Professor Wolff because he's very factual, he's very logical. And so, regardless of what you may think of yourself in terms of the ideology, the diagnosis and solutions are perfect. So, welcome, Professor Wolff.
Well, with such a lovely introduction, I can only say thank you. I'm very glad to be here. And I hope to be able to live up to your very generous description.
Well, I have no doubt at all. So, the first question is that a lot of people may say the US is doing great. It's the number one economy. The GDP is growing very well. It has mighty military, and you have all the science and technology and innovation. You have freedom and democracy. So, what more do you need? And what is the problem that we should be concerned about?
Well, your description is one that would make President Biden beam with pleasure. It is the kind of description that he and his regime spend enormous resources trying to persuade the American people to believe. Half the American people already don't agree with it, and a large part of the other half are very worried that it's mostly verbiage and not much substance that's there. So let me begin. I was born in the United States. I've lived here all my life. I am speaking to you from the island of Manhattan in the middle of New York City, which is the financial and economic center of this country and has been for at least the last century. And I've been a professor of economics all my adult life in half a dozen different universities. And here is a summary of what I'm about to explain. The condition of the American economy today is the worst that I have seen in my lifetime. Not only that, but if I could bring to your microphone and your camera my colleagues on the left and my colleagues on the right, we do not agree on how we got into this situation, and we do not agree on how to get out of it. But we probably do agree with my assessment that this is the worst condition of the American economy in our lifetimes. Let me explain. I will start with the fact that the United States has enjoyed, over most of the last century, the situation you described, a growing economy, a prospering economy, reasonable civil liberties and civil rights, at least for white people, at least for male people, and so on. I won't bore you with the descriptions. It has been a good time for the United States. It emerged from World War II, the only economy where no war had been fought other than the attack on Pearl Harbor at the beginning. No bombs fell here. Meanwhile, all the potential competitors, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Italy, Russia, were destroyed, and they could not compete. And the world after 1945 was even more dominated by the United States than it had been in the early parts of last century, of the 20th century. And we're all familiar with that. The United States as the dominant military power, the United States dollar as the global currency that every other country had to deal with, the dominance of American technology coming out of Silicon Valley and with companies like Apple and Google and Intel and IBM and all the rest. But here's the important thing for all of you to understand. That period of the United States is over, and it is not coming back. We have had our good time. We have had our time as the dominant economic and political power of the world, U.S. hegemony, the American empire, the successor to the British Empire that you know so well. And we are now experiencing the much less attractive phenomena of being a declining economic power rather than a rising one. And I understand that much of your audience may be surprised because this is something that the United States is mostly engaged at this point in trying to deny, to not see, to pretend it isn't happening. That becomes more difficult each day, but the government and the politicians for sure feel the need to be cheerleaders, to celebrate every day that which is disappearing every day. And that's an understandable human response. It is not fun to go down economically. It's much more pleasurable to go up. You want the rising tide to lift all the boats. The problem is the declining tide brings all the boats down with it. And that's what we have now. Number two, we have here in the United States, in addition to the up and down problem I summarized a moment ago, we have the fact that for the first time in a century, the United States has a real global economic competitor, able to do everything it does and to do many things better than it does. Either better quality or lower cost or both. You know, we didn't have that in the 20th century. The British Empire was declining. The German hope to be a competitor was destroyed in World War I. And the Soviet Union, whatever you think about it, was never an economic competitor. It had nuclear weapons, it had a military, it was a political force of importance, but economically, no, it never was. To give you an idea, even now, the GDP of Russia, the successor to the Soviet Union, is about $1.5 to $2 trillion per year. The GDP of the United States is $23 or $24 trillion per year. There is no contest here. There is no economic equivalence or anything remotely like it. But there is a country that is the competitor, and that is the People's Republic of China. And anyone who doesn't understand that is not paying attention. All the statistics show it. The GDP, for example, of China now is around 17 or 18 trillion dollars. Many, many times larger than that of Russia, and getting closer each day to that of the United States. We expect in the United States that the GDP of China, in the varying ways you can measure it, will be larger than that of the United States by the end of this decade, by the end of the 2020s. So everyone should understand it's a radically different world economy. Once upon a time, that world economy was dominated by the United States, and even more so by the United States and its major allies, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Canada. Those together are the G7. The G7 power was the dominant world economy group. Any other country in the world looking for a loan or looking for a deal to help develop their own society would go to New York or Washington or London or Paris in order to approach the economic wealth and power where it was concentrated. Nowadays, they still go to those places, but they have an option. They have an alternative. They can go to Beijing. They can go to New Delhi. They can go to what we now call the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, plus a half a dozen other countries that have joined the BRICS, and another half dozen that will be doing so very soon. It is a new world economy. Let me summarize it with a statistic that we work with in economics. The gross domestic product, GDP, is a rough measure of the total output of goods and services in a country in one calendar year. All right, the GDP of the G7, the United States and its allies, today is about 29% of the total output of goods and services on the planet Earth. The GDP of the BRICS, the original BRICS, the 5 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is today about 32% of the global output. In other words, the BRICS have already surpassed the G7. And that already happened in the year 2020, and the gap between them gets larger every day. As if to make it as dramatic as I can, we now have the statistics for economic growth in the first quarter of the year 2024, the year we are in. The growth of the GDP in China for this period is estimated to be around 2.93% on an annual basis. The figure for the United States, 1.6%. In other words, economic growth in China is twice what it is here. But the important point is the economic growth per year of output in China has been 2 to 3 times that of the United States every year for the last 30. In other words, this is not a temporary phenomenon. This is a world historical change. Whatever you like, and I have as many criticisms of China as anyone else does. It's not a perfect society. It has its strengths and weaknesses like every other society. But it is childish to pretend that the Chinese have not figured out, in a way not yet replicated anywhere else, how on a long-term basis to have unequaled rates of economic growth. They've figured that out. That combination of private and state enterprises, the governing role of the Communist Party, the way they've organized the society, whatever else its strengths and weaknesses, if you're measuring economic growth, there is no other country that has achieved that kind of growth in this short a historical time. And we ought to learn from them rather than pretend this isn't happening. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Now the problems of the United States, very briefly. We have now for 30 years not raised the real wage of our workers. If you adjust the money wage earned by the working class for the prices they have to pay. Because that's what matters. It matters not how much money you get at the end of the week. It matters how much can you buy with the money that you get. What can you afford for yourself, for your family, and so on. And if you adjust the wages for the prices, workers today get very little more than what they got in the 1970s. Right? People have to understand that. Meanwhile, the productivity of the American worker has gone up every year, 1-2%. So our workers are producing more and more for the employer, but getting less, getting the same amount from the employer. The wages are flat, the productivity is rising. You don't need a PhD in economics, although I have that. You don't need it to understand that the wealth inequality is going to go crazy if you allow workers to produce more and more for the employer while the employer pays them the same, right? Employers in the United States are 3% of our population. Employees is everybody else. The employers have become wildly wealthy. That's why I'm sure your audience knows names like Elon Musk or Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, or because these people are the modern pharaoh. They are the people with tens or in some cases hundreds of billions of dollars worth of personal wealth. They can decide each day whether to send rockets to the moon or whether to invent a new process or buy a 15th yacht or whatever they want, because they're like children with play money. We have created an enormous wealth at the top, but we have eviscerated what made the United States unique, a vast, quote, middle class. People that were not poor, they were not rich, they were in the middle, and there were millions and millions of them. And modern American economics is really about the remarkable way this country developed over mostly the 20th century, serving this growing middle class. That's all gone. Our middle class is destroyed. The bitterness and anger of the middle class is available for you to see every day because it has a puppet who acts out their anger, and his name is Donald Trump. And that's what he represents, a politician who understood what I've just said and who realized he could build a political career as the voice of this enormous, bitter, angry middle class. He feeds them scapegoats. You're angry and bitter. You don't have a good job. Your children have no chance at a good job. Well, it's all the fault of these immigrants who come to this country. It's stupid. It makes no sense. There's no evidence for any of it, but it's a convenient way to release anger and bitterness. And if it isn't that, well, then get angry at students who are demonstrating because they don't like what Israel does to Gaza and that the fact that the United States supports it. So you get angry police who come from the middle class and who are angry at students who they see as a privileged minority. And there's an element of truth there, but it is an outrage that comes out of our society. And we therefore suffer the reality of a country that promised its people a middle-class life, but cannot now deliver that, and is producing all of the pathology, all of the trouble, tremendous divisiveness. Parts of the country, like the South, wrapped up in Trump craziness, bitter about what's happening, enraged at the other parts of the country that are still prosperous, and there are some. The East Coast and the West Coast are relatively more prosperous, and so they have a different mentality. The country is divided politically with a hatred and a bitterness that I've never seen before, and it does not know how to solve its problems. And each day, the Chinese are showing us they can do whatever we do with high technology, only better. They make a better telephone. They make a better guidance system for missiles. I mean, the American loss of understanding of the world is, let me finish with this, is evidence for all of you to see in the terrible mistakes being made that are not merely mistakes of a judgment. That always happens a little bit. But we're seeing mistakes that come out of a lack of understanding of the basic changes around us. You're seeing, I'll give you an example. Number one, we enter a war with Russia in Ukraine in February of 2022. And we are told by our leader, President Biden, and by the entire government that this war will be over quickly, that Russia cannot do this, and that we will stop them by equipping the powerful Ukrainian army that we've been training for 10 years, and we will give them all the equipment they need, and Russia will fall apart, the ruble will collapse, blah, 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 blah. All wrong. All completely did not understand, for example, that Russia has a good relationship with China and India, and that China and India will buy the oil that Europe refuses to buy. And if they do that, then Russia will be able to sustain its economy and fight the war. They didn't understand it. And that's not because they made a mistake looking at statistics. It's because they don't want to see how the world has changed. They don't want to understand that Russia, China, and India together have a quantity of wealth that they cannot approach yet already. And there's still countries, India and China particularly, that are developing quickly and that are amassing real wealth in different ways. I understand they're very different societies, but they are not part of the West in the way that the rest of the G7 are. And this is changing everything. They made the tremendous mistake, and they are in the process now of losing the Ukrainian war and getting closer and closer to making a decision between admitting the loss, which they don't want to do, or using nuclear weapons, which the whole world has to hope they don't do because of what that will mean for all the rest of us. But that's a dead end they have worked their way into. They are now busily supporting Israel in a situation that isolates Israel from every other country in the planet. You know, for a little country that in the end relies on the United States, this is one step short of self-destruction. What is the United States doing? Allying itself uncritically with a small country in the process of self-destruction. This is bizarre. It shows you the bizarreness. Students across the United States are rising up across all universities, east, west, north, south. And their statement is saying, why are we supporting the massacre of one population by another? Why are we funding the Israeli weapons, and now we're funding the humanitarian aid to the victims of those weapons? This is lunacy. And the stupidity of the American government, there's no other way to describe this.
Wow.
The stupidity is to throw police at the students. Guess what? It makes the students more angry. It makes the students now have a new issue. The issue isn't anymore just Israel and Palestine. The issue is now freedom of speech. The government is trying to shut down the students who are saying we disagree with the policy. The United States goes around the world, as you know, lecturing people on free speech and free assembly, and now denying it to its own students. I mean, this is a country falling apart. I have no other ways. I wish I had other ways to describe it to you, but it is literally falling apart.
Wow.
And people should understand it is no longer capable of playing the role it did in the 20th century. Now it is trying to play almost like a puppeteer with puppets, hoping the world doesn't recognize that it can't do it. It's all bluff. Other than the weapons, it still has dominant nuclear weapons. How dominant? We don't know. What's crystal clear is that they cannot win wars, proxy wars. They cannot take countries like Ukraine, arrange for them to have a war with Russia and expect them to win. Russia is winning. The United States is losing. And everybody who pays attention here knows it. And what you're seeing then is that the mask, the pretense, is disintegrating. And it's making the country crazy. It makes our politicians have to say things that only make the problem worse. And the attempted repression of the students is another example of misunderstanding. When President Biden said he's 100% behind the leader in Israel, Mr. Netanyahu, he made a strategic mistake that may well cost him the election, because he didn't understand that masses of people in the United States are more sympathetic to the Palestinians than they are to the Israelis. And that includes either a large part or a majority of Jewish people who would otherwise be friendly to Israel, but on this subject do not agree with, just as inside Israel, there's a big opposition to what he's doing. But you put all this together, and this is a society in extreme disintegration, and it should be understood by the rest of the world. Otherwise, you in your parts of the world will make miscalculations the way the leadership in the United States is doing that. And these are becoming very large, very expensive miscalculations.
Okay, that's a lot to digest. And I have like 15 different follow-up questions. But so let's do this, okay? Suppose if you were in charge of the US, okay? So they made Professor Wolff the dictator of the US, and they gave you whatever power you wanted. So what would you do to make America great again?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just as there are 15 follow-up questions, there are 15 ways to begin to make an answer. I think in the interest of time and to say what is most important, I think we have to, in the United States, undertake a national conversation about our economic system. This is a country that is built on unregulated, more than in other countries, capitalism. We have been a capitalist country from the beginning. Those who came here, we behaved in a way that is, maybe I should qualify it, European capitalism. We have to understand what that meant, and we have to talk about it. We have to therefore talk about the fact that we are a nation built on ethnic cleansing, that Europeans came here and systematically destroyed the non-European people that were here before us. Because that when you do that, when you come and eradicate a population, the effects of that last a very long time. It's not just that it's unjust, which it was. It's not just that it was murderous, which it was. But ironically, the scars of that decision are with us today and are a major part of American culture. Having destroyed the indigenous people here, what we did was discover we could not build, we Americans, I mean now, we could not build an economy simply on the basis of the immigrants from Europe who came here, who took it over. The indigenous population would not work for the Europeans. There were efforts to do that. They failed. And so the indigenous people were killed, were destroyed. First by literally shooting and killing them, then by forcing them on restricted reservations where the few remnants of them still live to this day. They are the worst fed, they are the sickest, they have the shortest lifespan. It is an unspeakable horror throughout our history, but one that has never been honestly faced. Number two, to get the work done on the one industry that early America had, which was the production of cotton to ship to Britain to fund its industrial growth as a producer of cotton textiles, right? The cotton had to be sourced someplace because you can't grow cotton in Britain. You have to get the cotton, and the American South was a place where you could grow cotton, but you had no labor. So you brought black people from Africa in huge numbers, slaves, to work in the cotton fields in order to produce the one product that the United States, as a poor colony, could sell back to England. Just as, for example, India, Calcutta, all of that was transformed to fit the needs of the British Empire, so was the United States in a different way. But we brought over slaves, and we fought a civil war between the slave and the capitalist sector, and the capitalist sector destroyed and absorbed it. All of that is part of our history. The race relations are not really race relations. The race is the least important part of it. In the end, what difference does it make, right? The color of your skin is about as interesting as the shape of your elbow. But it was a historical development. That was what power. Those people with the dark skin were slaves of the people with the white skin. That was important. That shaped the culture and the violence and the injustice. That's part of us right now. One of the key supports of Mr. Trump is white supremacy, the return to the United States for millions of people, or believing that white skin is not only different from, but superior as a human being to black skin or brown skin. We thought we had defeated and destroyed that crazy idea. It's back because people are in trouble, and then the scars come back. We have relied on one kind of economic system, capitalism. And by capitalism, I mean something very specific. Organizing production, not as master and slave, not as lord and serf, as in feudalism, but the particular capitalist arrangement in which there are employers and employees, in which the employer purchases the labor effort of the employee. You are not allowed to own the employee, but you are allowed to own the labor effort. You purchase from the worker 8 hours of your brains and your muscles to do what the employer tells you to do. Okay, that's a very particular way of doing things. As I told you, the US Census, employers are 3% of the population. Employees, pretty much everybody else. That means that you're organizing the production of goods and services that everybody depends on, your clothing, your computer, your meal, if you go to a restaurant, whatever it is, you're accepting that everything we depend on is produced by an arrangement that has a tiny group of people in the position of employer and a vast group of dependent people who are in the position of employee.
So one quick...
Here's my most important point.
Yeah.
That ought to be questioned. Why are we doing that? We, as a species, we got rid of slavery. We got rid of feudalism. What is this with capitalism? Why is it not also questioned? Why do not we ask the question, why not, and let me be very clear where I'm coming from, why do we not think it might be much better to organize the factory, the office, the store as a community, as a collective of people, all of whom are equal? Employer, employee, that's gone. We are a community that together will decide what we produce, how we go about it, where we do it, and what we do with the results of our labor. We don't have to divide ourselves into employer and employee any more than we had to divide ourselves into master and slave, lord and serf, all of that. That I think we need to do that because here's the punchline. I think the roots of the problem for the United States is its reliance on the capitalist way of organizing production. And by the way, so we put our cards on the table. If you had asked me about the economy of China or the economy of India or the economy of Brazil and so on, I would have said to you the same thing. They have accepted there the employer-employee relationship. To take the example of China, they have organized both in their private sector and in their government sector. The enterprises have employers and employees. I understand why they did that. I understand they took that from the West. I understand the reasons why they did it. But I believe, and especially for those who say they are socialist, that they ought to be having a conversation about that organization and its legacy from the West, because I think having borrowed it from the West when the West was more advanced, they are now entering a time when the West is going down, and maybe now they will question what they took from the West because they're seeing that it can fuel the rise of the American empire and of the British, but it can also be the end of those empires. The capitalism has made the decision. It left Britain long ago. It is leaving the United States as we speak. The dynamic center of capitalism is now in China, in India, in Brazil, not in Western Europe or North America. And the world has to catch up to understanding what that means.
So would your solution be similar to having labor unions, or is it something else?
It's something else, because I have no disrespect for labor unions. I understand why they exist. They were the natural, normal, logical outcome of capitalism. If you have a small group of employers and a mass of employees, then you have a disparity of power right there. Obviously, the employer has the ultimate power because he can deprive the employee of the job, of the income. The dependence there is staggering. The employee does not have that power over the employer, but the employer does have. I mean, the inequality here is grotesque. And so we have unions as the effort of the employee to be less at the disposal of the power of the employer, and that's what a union is for, and that's what a union does. To say the same thing in a different way, the job of the union is to get a better deal from the employer for the employee. But what I'm talking about is different. I want to get rid of the different. I don't want the negotiation. I don't want that fight. I don't understand why we should have it. I want us to be a community of equals. None of us can fire the other one. Anyone loses the job, that has to be the decision of the community as a whole. That, by the way, does not guarantee that there will not be injustices of one kind or another. But I don't want the structured injustice. And when I teach my classes, I try to get this idea across to students in the following way. Suppose you were planning a picnic for your family, and that you have a large family, maybe 50 people in your family. But you knew that most people like each other, they're part of the family, but that Uncle Frank and Aunt Louise hate each other, just the way it happened. Would you organize the picnic by asking Frank and Louise to be the committee that is in charge? No, because they are people who don't work together. So for me, the critique of capitalism comes if what you want is to produce the goods and services that we all depend on. Why would you create a situation of such enmity, of such inequality, of such a relationship that is bound to be full of horror and violence and hatred and distrust? That's crazy. We don't need a capitalist system to get the work done. What I'm in favor of, if you want to, is sometimes called a cooperative, is sometimes called a commune, has a variety of names, because human beings have understood that that is something we ought to think about for thousands of years. It's not new, but it is an alternative to capitalism. And again, as I said, I'm not demanding the revolution tomorrow. I'm saying when capitalism works as badly for as many people as it has, it's long past the time that we should be debating the pros and cons of capitalism relative to the pros and cons of alternatives. And the only reason we don't do it is that the capitalists are afraid of letting us do that. I am the product here in the United States of the elite institutions. I was a student at Harvard, then I was at Stanford, and I finished at Yale. If you're familiar with the American academic scene, those are the elite institutions. All my education was a celebration of capitalism. I was never encouraged to learn about, or to think about, or to explore alternatives. Never, never. I had good professors. They meant well. This is not a critique particularly of them. But the taboo was rigid, so that my colleagues now, I'll give you an example. People enjoy it when I say this. I was in the same PhD class of economics at Yale at the same time as a woman named Janet Yellen, who's now the economics minister here. She had the same teachers I did at the same time. She heard the same lectures in the same rooms at the same university. So I know what I got my PhD from the same group of faculty she did. I know what she learned because it's what I learned. Okay? And I know she doesn't know anything about alternatives. And that's not her fault. I mean, she could have done it later after she graduated, but she didn't. And she made it her way up, as you can see, to the heights of American political life. I didn't. I became a professor of economics, which gave me the time and the leisure to learn about alternatives. But those alternatives exist.
So where did you learn? I mean, so where did you learn about socialism, Marxism, etc.?
I had to go out and find it. I had to do that on my own as an interested student. But you know, if you go to the library and you look it up, There's lots of literature there. There are people all over the world in every country doing this kind of thinking, doing this kind of work, writing this stuff, having conferences, building organizations that support it. If you want to find it, it's there. And I wasn't the only one. There were other students. We found each other and we got together to talk about this, to read what we heard was important. We read Mr. Marx and we read Lenin and we read and fill in the blank. And we learned about this, but we did it on our own because it was a taboo in our universities. And even now, one of the reasons I'm able to function here in the United States is not because I know about that stuff. It is despite the fact that I know about that stuff. It's because I have the pedigree. If you're in England, you wave Oxford and Cambridge. If you're in India, you wave New Delhi. And on and on and on. Or Delhi. I have the pedigree. I'm the product of, I know all these people. They also know me perfectly, personally in some cases. So I am in that position. Luckily, I am therefore able to function. I've been a professor all my life. I am a professor now here in New York City. But I have an audience in part, as you were so kind to introduce me, because I try to make these points clear, direct. I'm not asking anyone to salute some abstraction, but reason with me about these things. And I think you'll find what I have to say interesting, worth a few moments of your thought, and not something that threatens you in a way that you have to turn away from.
So one question I had was, have you had a chance to study the Mittelstand from Germany? How they have all these small firms in towns and the rural areas, and they sort of seem to reflect your vision, like where the employer and the employees, they work together, and people, they work for the same company for their whole lives. It's like a small, medium business, and it's a sense of community.
Yeah.
And they're also very successful, and they have these amazing products with great quality and technology.
Yeah, but the short answer to your question, and this is just so you know something about me personally, my first language is German.
Oh, wow.
My mother was born in Berlin. She was, because of the Nazi movement and World War II, she and my father became refugees and went to the United States just to be safe. They were running away from war. No other reason. So I was born in the United States, but for the first 5 years of my life, I spoke only German at home to my mother, and French because my father came from the part of Europe on the border between France and Germany, a city you may know called Metz, M-E-T-Z. It is technically in France now, but as the word Metz suggests, it's a German word and has a German origin. So I follow German politics. I read and write German fluently. I have given talks in Germany many times. I'm very well aware of the Mittelstand. I'm aware, for example, that Germany has a law, has been on the books for a long time, which is a law described by the German word Mitbestimmung and translated into English, co-determination. And it's a law which says in every German factory, if it has more than 2,000 workers, just under half of the board of directors of the company must be individuals elected by the workers.
Wow.
It requires workers to be participants in running an enterprise. And if you are smaller than 2,000, but more than 50, then I believe it's 30% of the board of directors is elected by the. Okay, this is unheard of in Britain or in the United States. We have nothing like that, nothing remotely like that. We would think that's communism or that's socialism. It just shows you the Germans have a long history of a very powerful socialist movement. You have to understand German history to understand that. The first really mass, powerful socialist party in Europe was in Germany. You know, Karl Marx was a German. The early power of the Marxian thinking happened in Vienna, a German-speaking capital of Austria, or in Berlin. And, you know, at the time of World War I, the Socialist Party of Germany was the number 2 party in the country. It had become a mass movement. Socialism is built in to the culture of Germany in a way that even the Hitler experience of Nazism, where large numbers of these people were killed, did not end that. Look, that's why a person who's a socialist, Olaf Scholz, not much of one, but he is one, is the head of Germany now. It's because socialism is an accepted part. If you go to Berlin today, you will see Karl Marx Allee. You will see Rosa Luxemburg Square. The heroes of the Marxist, socialist, and communist movements remain heroes even now when Germany is very much a capitalist country, because it's part of what all Germans recognize as their history. And that's why you have a different kind of capitalism. But I must tell you that your image, while it's correct, is now dying. That part of Germany is in great difficulty because, in large part, they misunderstood the changing world. German prosperity over the last 30 years had 2 crucial supports it no longer has. Number one, it was able to get cheaper energy, oil and gas, from Russia than any of its competitors could get anywhere else. So it outperformed Britain, France, Italy, in large part because it was the recipient of cheap oil and gas from Russia. And the second thing was it had a customer. Chinese industrialization heavily relied upon German machine tools, German techniques, and the Chinese wanted it, and the Chinese purchased it, and the Germans wanted to sell it to the Chinese. So they got cheap energy from Russia and a fantastic market of industrial growth from China. And they now have lost both of those. The Chinese don't want to patronize the Germans. They want to give that business to their own companies, to Russian, to Indian, to the Indonesian, to others. And the Germans, going along with the United States and Ukraine, are no longer able to bring in cheap Russian energy. So they lost the very 2 crucial elements of what was making them successful. And bigger corporations may be able to survive, Volkswagen or Siemens or the other major German, but the smaller ones, this is too difficult for them. They can't afford the energy cost, and they can't find customers to replace those lost in China. And so that very Mittelstand, use a German word if you're familiar, the Mittelstand verschwindet, it's disappearing.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Wolff.
My pleasure, and I hope that we will have a chance to continue the conversation in the near future.